Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. This episode, we're going to review something I had already just talked about in a previous video recently, which is the subject of R.I.C.O, which is the Racketeering Influence Corrupt Organization Act. In response to me posting that particular podcast, a referral, a link was sent to my producer from someone named Ken White. I don't know Ken. This is not a criticism of Ken in any manner, shape, or form. He writes and publishes through a website called popat.com. And what he did in one of his articles was he specifically attacked, as he calls it, law splainer. Specifically, the article is, "It's not R.I.C.O." And rather than try to recite the website address here, I'll provide a link in the description that's attached to this video so you'll understand the point I'm coming from. However, the reason why this was sent to my producer was to underscore what R.I.C.O is. And I think it's a very dangerous mindset, especially when the people who are trying to direct your attention here are simply trying to get you to not pay attention to actually what R.I.C.O is and how powerful it is and what its original intent and purpose are. Ken takes the history of the R.I.C.O act that actually the act that actually led to R.I.C.O and the history and everything else, and tries to encapsulate it and say, well, this is where it came from, and therefore that's what it was for, and this is what the law is, and everything else is just a waste of time. And that particular aspect of trying to explain the law just is broken. And it's broken, it's broken, it's broken, it's broken. And yes, R.I.C.O is probably overused, just like Section 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 is overused. I mean, the reason why we had the Prison Litigation Reform Act to begin with was because inmates were filing ridiculous lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits. The very famous chocolate cake for dinner argument, claiming that because we didn't get served chocolate cake for dinner, it's a civil rights violation. Obviously, that is a completely inappropriate aspect and application of a civil rights violation. It's not a civil rights violation whether you get chocolate cake or not. And I'm sure there's a host of people out here who do not understand what R.I.C.O really is and will overuse it. Absolutely. And in that, Ken is not wrong. Nor is he wrong in the aspect that this bill originated with the investigation and inquiry into organized crime. Again, he's not wrong in that. What he is wrong is that in the final version of the bill is far more broad sweeping than just dealing with crime families, just dealing with syndicate type operations. And to sit here and say that this is the only aspect that the law is for and everyone else who's out here is doing it is wasting their time is a dangerous provision. And the fact that this particular link was sent to my producer is an attempt to underscore what R.I.C.O is. And therefore, I'm addressing this episode and we're reevaluating and revisiting the subject of R.I.C.O so that we can try to understand the concept a little better. I think the best way to do that is to actually study the history of R.I.C.O, where it came from, what its background is, and why Ken, came to the understanding and belief that this was a crime bill, only dealing with crime families, only dealing with their influence over legitimate businesses. Because that certainly was where the aspects of this came from. It's just not where it grew to. I mean, Ken clearly does not understand R.I.C.O in the respect that R.I.C.O is a provision far and above just organized crime. The legislators may have started with language. They actually did. They had language in there that referred to criminal organizations, to crimes, and they changed that language deliberately to allow for a broader perspective of this law. They changed. They used the word enterprise. Any enterprise that fits within the definition of R.I.C.O and what they call racketeering activity, which is a repeated conduct of the same criminal activity, is considered a violation of R.I.C.O. They didn't say criminal enterprise. They said any enterprise. If it was meant to be only dealing with crime families, only dealing with criminal syndicates, only dealing with crime families and the mafia and everything else, then it would say criminal enterprise. And the language did exist in the original law when it was in the Senate, before it came back, went over to the House, was revised, came back to the Senate for being passed. The language was in there. It was removed for a reason. And that the fact that it was removed means that there was obviously the intent to take it beyond that narrow scope. Also, the aspect of filing civil suits. Do you really think that the Congress is writing a law so that common, ordinary people can pursue civil suits against crime families? I mean, come on. It's the Godfather. The Godfather's going to make you swim with the fishes if you try to sue me. I mean, come on. What crime family is going to let Joe Blow on the street sue them and not have them go turn up headless in the bay? It makes absolutely no sense when you look at the language of the law and the spirit of the law and how it was changed from its original form into the form it actually finally passed and was signed into law as, to say this is limited and intended to only deal with crime families and only deal with criminal enterprises. That's just not what it is. Yes, it's probably overused. Every aspect of law is overused. We have litigious individuals who file lawsuits over the single most ridiculous things you can imagine. It doesn't make the law any less the law. It just means these people don't understand the law. I mean, trying to understand, I'm talking with my producer about the idea of the sovereignty of the states, about how you can't have the federal government come in and just say, we're going to take over a local case because the local case isn't being run right. No. The 11th Amendment says the states are sovereign from the federal government. The federal government cannot come in and supervise the ongoing conduct of the court. They can review it after the fact. They can come in and do a certiorari review to the U.S. Supreme Court once the state remedies are exhausted. But the federal government can't come in and just take over the court, can't send a federal judge into the local county courthouse, have them sit on the bench and take over a case. It doesn't work that way because the states are sovereign. That's what the 11th Amendment does. People misunderstand it all the time. They're constantly filing actions in courts, in the federal courts, trying to seek remedy and relief because they think that they can. Obviously, they can't. The 11th Amendment forbids it. But here we are. So, dealing with the history of this and trying to understand where this came from, I'm going to explain the history of where Ken's understanding and perception of this probably comes from. Again, I don't know Ken. I am only looking at his perspective as he wrote on this particular post. And I'm going to go ahead and try to deal with the history of it and explain where the foundations of this came from so I can try to get a better understanding and possibly a better viewpoint of why Ken thinks this. I am not saying Ken's a bad person. I don't know Ken. I don't think he's being malicious. I just don't think he completely grasps the proper function here. And I'm hoping that if Ken does see this, that Ken will actually read it and understand and have a better understanding himself of why RICO is far broader than what he perceives it to be. First of all, this really started back in 1949. Even though this is a 1970 law, this was many decades in coming. The perception of what crime families were was starting to infiltrate its way into the federal level. The congressmen were trying to get a grasp on it. But in 1949, the American Municipality Association, which represents 10,000 cities nationwide, began to petition the federal government to look into organized crime as it was infiltrating legitimate business activity in their communities. Of course, this got into Congress. The Senate picked it up. The Commerce and the Judiciary Committees were fighting back and forth as to who should have jurisdiction over this subject. And finally, it was settled by just a line down the middle vote to set up a special committee. And the special committee that was set up, it was called the Special Committee on Organized Crime and Interstate Commerce. And that was in 1950. It's very popularly known as the Kefauver Committee because that was the freshman senator who actually set up and established the committee. Some of their findings that set the foundations for what would eventually graduate into RICO law, and I'm going to read a couple of quotes from this. In 1951, during what was known as the 82nd Congress, one of the quotes was one of the most perplexing problems in the field of organized crime is presented by the fact that criminals and racketeers are using the profits of organized crime to buy up and operate legitimate business enterprises. Fair assessment. This is an observation. This is troubling. You have organized crime not only conducting criminal activity, but taking the profits and proceeds of that and buying up legitimate businesses. This is how, the pizza houses. You hear these stories about how the crime families buy up pizza houses and they're running their operations through pizza houses. Well, they buy up legitimate fronts, they buy up legitimate businesses. The list of industries noted about this included advertising, amusement, appliances, automobile, baking, ballrooms, bowling alleys, banking, basketball, boxing, cigarette distribution, coal, communications, construction, drugstores, electrical equipment, florists, food, football, garments, gas, hotels, import export businesses, insurance, jukebox trade, laundry, liquor, news services, newspapers, oil, paper products, radio, real estate, restaurants, scrap shipping, steel, surplus, television, theaters, and transportation. Broad range of businesses, legitimate businesses, not criminal businesses, legitimate businesses that anybody else could be running and operating. And yet, these businesses are being cornerstoned and undermined by organized crime who are putting their profits and proceeds into these businesses to basically corner the market and make themselves even more money. And here's a quote directly from an observation made in 1950 in this committee is, in most cases, these are enterprises in which gangster methods have been used to obtain monopolies so that their vicious practices taint otherwise legitimate businesses. They're able to compete unfairly with legitimate businessmen because of their accumulation of cash and their vicious methods. Yeah, they run everyone else out of town. You will either work for the mob or you're dead. You either do this business as a member of the mafia or you're dead. Yeah, so their vicious methods were used to corner the market, create monopolies within the local area, and they basically ran it. This family ran the Italian restaurant business. This family ran the docks. This family ran, the transportation industry, the shipping magnates in the area. This is how they set up. This is how they were operating. And as criminals were trying, or as the government was trying to come in and find ways to break down these criminal organizations, they were hiding behind these legitimate businesses and trying to get into these legitimate businesses and actually infiltrate them to find out how they were connected to the organized family was next to impossible. Especially since once they began to be investigated, they just go shift their money somewhere else. Okay, they're looking at the Bronx shipping warehouse. We're going to ship all the product that's of question down to the Long Island warehouse. Well, how do you stop all that? Well, that was a problem. So this committee came up and made some recommendations. It certainly it did lead to some legislation. It didn't lead into anything that was comprehensive enough to really deal with this as a large structure issue, which led to what's called the McClellan Committee, which is technically called the Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, that ran between 1957 and 1960. This particular committee established a clear connection between labor organizations and crime. It's also very famously known for exposing the existence of the mafia and the La Cosa Nostra crime families. But again, it fell short. The recommendations were there, the record was there, the investigations, massive investigations. Some legislation was recommended out of it, but the legislation that came out of it certainly wasn't stopping organized crime. It was not sweeping enough, not powerful enough. Then you came across what's known as the Katzenberg Commission. And this was actually a president's commission on law enforcement and administration of justice. And I know everyone hears that term and they think of our current president, President Trump, and thinks that he came up with the idea. He did not. He did not come up with this idea. He did not even come up with the name. This is a 1967 commission that was designed and performed its functions within a year's calendar time and was considered to have been the most comprehensive overview of law enforcement and administrative justice at the time. It was like sweeping. But what it did was it recommended new ways to control the infiltration of businesses by crime families and syndicate operations. Now, taking these recommendations, a few attempts were made, but they all failed until 1969. In 1969, previous bills that had made an attempt at trying to take these recommendations of the Katzenberg the Katzenbach Commission in 1967, were merged together between a couple of bills, and Senate Bill 30 was born. Now, Senate Bill 30 was the first effort to try to what would eventually become RICO. Now, of course, as you all are well aware, a bill comes up in the Senate, it's passed off to the House makes its recommendations, they come back together. If they can't come to an agreement, then they have a joint committee and they hash it out and try to find a bill that both chambers of Congress will pass. Well, in this particular instance, a couple of different bills were floating around the House, a couple of different bills were floating around the Senate, and eventually the Senate passed a bill and passed it over to the House to pass. The House decided they were going to come along and do its modifications, and they cut down a lot of stuff that was in the original bill, and a lot of the language got changed along the way, including things like removing criminal enterprises, removing criminal activity, and putting racketeering activity in its place, putting in the term any enterprise for criminal activity. It added the pattern of racketeering. It added the civil suit capacity. The changes in the language were intended to broaden the scope beyond the crime families, although it did actually, in many ways, curb the overreaching power of RICO, which is something the ACLU had a huge problem with at the time. They were making several attacks on the bills and the legislations that were being advanced forward. Even the American Bar Association weighed in. Ultimately, what happened is, after the House's bill was revised and sent back to the Senate had a choice. They could either take it and go to a joint committee between the two chambers of Congress, try to come up with a compromise bill, or they could pass it. The problem was they were coming right up to the end of their election cycle. They were looking at believing that if they tried to send it back to committee, that it would die. So they accepted the House's revisions and passed it up to the president, passed it in the Senate, passed it to the president. The president signed it in 1970, and it became the Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organization Act. But again, even the legislators who were writing the language and changing the language and changing the spirit of the whole core of the law, clearly stated they had every intention that this was no longer just a crime bill. Yes, its origins came from investigations and inquiries into criminal activity. But as they came along, they started studying things like how these mafia type organizations were able to get a foothold and a stranglehold on a specific type of business through their intimidations and through their criminal activity. They realized that it didn't just have to be a crime organization that was doing this. This was not attacking the crime families. This was attacking their legitimate business operations that were operating and being seeded by their criminal activity and their criminal money. This is about going after those pizzerias, going after the warehouses, going after the shipping companies, and in many cases, going after the labor unions that were influenced and controlled by the criminal organizations. RICO did not exist as an attack on crime, as much as it was an attack upon the conspiracy element of using criminal activity to seed and create actual legitimate business operations that were controlled with malicious intent, with this vicious cycle of threats and intimidation and outright murder to gain control of certain industries. That's what RICO was designed for. And as they were working on this law, the congressmen, both the senators and the congressmen in the House of Representatives, recognized that this needed to be broader. They couldn't say criminal activity anymore. That's why it substituted the word any enterprise. That's why racketeering activity was not racketeering or criminal racketeering or criminal activity, racketeering activity. Racketeering is simply the ongoing enterprise of doing something that violates the terms of RICO. So, yes, it was ignored at first because the language of it made it sound very much Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, and everyone knew it came from the crime investigations of 20 plus years. It came out of that, but that's not the baby that was born from that egg. The baby that was born from that egg was a completely different beast. It was a compromise between the aspects of pursuing organized crime and the recognition that they had actually created an entirely different problem. The criminals weren't just being criminals. They were running legitimate operations. They were taking over legitimate enterprises. They were making sure they monopolized in certain areas so only their crime families or their segments of influence, whether they're mafia or whether they were syndicate or whatever, were controlling one aspect of business. They cornered the market on it. And the more they cornered the market, the more they guaranteed their profits would flow only through their companies. Racketeering influenced and corrupt organizations. The name's right there, folks. You can spin it however you want. The name is there. It's not the racketeering crime families or the racketeer syndicate organizations. It is racketeer influenced and corrupt organizations. Not criminal organizations, corrupt organizations. So when you have someone like this author, like Ken White, coming and saying that this is only meant to deal with crime families, and that's what this is about, and that's anyone who uses it for any other purpose is wasting their time. No, absolutely not. It's far more broader. It's far more overreaching. It's been used against government entities. I In my previous video, I discussed quite extensively the Operation Courtroom. It's been used against Major League Baseball. It's been used against the Hellfire or against the Hell's Angels organization. It's been used against all kinds of people. Has it been overused by pro se litigants? Of course. Every aspect of law is overused by pro se litigants because most pro se litigants don't understand the law. And I get that, and it's not a criticism. There's a reason why lawyers do so well at their job because they do know the law in most cases. There are many lawyers who, quite frankly, don't deserve their credentials. Many of them are practicing in Montana. But the idea being that you can't sit here and say the racketeering influence organization because you don't want it to apply. It doesn't apply because it absolutely does. And I say that latter part because it's really important to understand that the person who made this referral is an attorney. The person, it sounds to me like the law explainer, Mr. White, is likely an attorney. Attorneys have reason not to employ RICO, just like they don't like employing conspiracies. They don't like to use, and when I say conspiracies, I'm not talking about conspiracy theories like, oh, aliens are responsible for Kennedy's murder. There were 10 people on the grassy knoll shooting between themselves, and the president was caught in the crossfire. Whatever conspiracy theory you want out there, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the actual legal definition of the word conspiracy, and it is actually a crime. It does exist. A conspiracy is simply a coordinated criminal activity between two or more people or organizations or something else. It is a coordination between two people or entities to commit crime with a common theme in the crime. Now, if you have one person rob a 7-Eleven and another person coming across the block and shooting at the 7-Eleven, unless those two are working together, that's not a conspiracy, even if the same victim is 7-Eleven, maybe even at the same time. However, if that shooter is designed to distract people away while the robber goes in and gets out, then it's a conspiracy because those people are working together to commit a common crime. And so when I say conspiracies, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the conspiracy theorists. I'm talking about conspiracies as they exist in real life. But because the term has gotten such a bad rap, judges don't like them, attorneys don't like them, and most especially, and I've mentioned this before in previous videos, lawyers are a racketeering organization. They absolutely are. Because they practice in defending each other from consequence. Now, not all. I'm not saying every attorney out there is a criminal, by no stretch of the imagination. The ones operating within the Great Montana Conspiracy most definitely are. Even if they don't participate actively, they are fully knowledge this is going on, and they do and say nothing. They are silent collaborators. If you are aware that a murder is committed, and you say nothing, you are a collaborator in that murder. After the fact, certainly, but you are a collaborator. You are a co-conspirator in hiding that murder. And so long as you are, you're just as guilty as the person who committed the murder under the law. There's lots of reasons why you might not want to be afraid for your own personal safety. You're worried about backlash. Is the person going to come after me? Maybe they're a friend of yours and you don't want that friend to fall. Regardless of your motivation and for keeping the secret, the law says if you keep the secret, you're a criminal. Just the way it is. Attorneys practice deceit. By their very nature, by the very definition of their job, they lie, they manipulate, they change details to make it look like their client, whoever their client is free of liability or is innocent of an allegation or crime. So why is it such a stretch of imagination to believe they would exercise this skill to defend each other? Normally, you have a more active bar association or review process. Montana is all about pretense. Yes, we have the rules of professional conduct in Montana, which supposedly set out the standards by which attorneys are supposed to operate, the ethics by which they're supposed to do. They don't follow them. I can't think of a single attorney I've ever dealt with, and I've dealt with a lot of them here in Montana, who I can say with absolute certainty is following the rules of professional conduct. So everyone knows the attorneys aren't. Everyone who's an attorney knows other attorneys who aren't. They know themselves they aren't. And therefore they protect each other. And remember, this is a group that controls exactly 1/3 of our government in Montana, because in Montana, to be a judge, you have to be a lawyer. So, I mean, you're not required to have any kind of legal background, college degree, certification of any type of intelligence to be the president of the United States. And no, that's not a slam on Trump. I'm just making a point. The highest office in our country requires absolutely no certification to hold. A hobo living on the street could run for president and get it and take over the White House and the government with absolutely no understanding of how it worked. You could have anyone of legal age, and I believe the age in the United States by Constitution is the age of 40. Anyone of legal age can hold the office of President of the United States. No other pre-existing qualifications other than the fact you be a citizen of the United States. A legal citizen born naturalized here. Okay. To be a judge, you have to go to school, certification. You have to be a member of this special elite group that is self-censored, by the way, not overseen by government, self-censored by their own associations, their own group of people that actually censor and review. There is absolutely no effort to have committees or oversight beyond that. And they're not held to their boundaries. So when you have lawyers sit here and criticize something like RICO, you have to wonder why they're criticizing RICO, why they're trying to discourage people from thinking about RICO. Well, maybe it's because they're worried that someone might bring a RICO charge against them, because they are part of a racketeering, influenced, and corrupt organization. They are an organization that, when left to their own devices, like what we're dealing with here in Montana, shelter and protect corrupt individuals, protect criminal activity, participate in criminal activity, and then profit from it in legitimate business practices, which is the very thing that RICO was set up to stop. So when asking why you're attacking RICO and why you're trying to undermine its integrity, what you need to ask is, what reason do they have to do that? What motivation do they have? Do they have a vested interest in undermining the public perception of RICO? And when it comes to attorneys, oh yeah, they do, especially in Montana. So the bottom line of all this is about revisiting RICO and discussing this and discussing the history, is that this bill sprang from review of organized crime. And people use that the seed of it came from these reviews, to readily disguise the fact that it's a much bigger creature that ended up being grown at the end. Perhaps it was created from the Review of Organized Crime, but it was written in a much broader scope, beyond organized crime and into the world beyond, to anybody who's using these methods and these practices to profit from criminal activity. You don't have to be a crime family to do that. You don't. You can just be three kids sitting in a garage and decide you're going to go commit crimes. Congratulations. If your actions cross over into what qualifies as RICO, you can be prosecuted under RICO. Federal or state judges in Florida prosecuted under RICO. They weren't crime families. They weren't even paying money to the crime families. They themselves were the crime family, if that's the definition. They were the ones accepting bribes. They were the ones manipulating evidence. They were the ones releasing evidence and hiding it, all because they were receiving bribes. You think that is a crime family? You think that's the mafia? No, that's judicial officials acting as a racketeering, influenced, and corrupt organization. And that's what we have to deal with. That's when you think about RICO and you think about people who are trying to denounce RICO, ask why are they denouncing RICO? Why are they trying to convince you it's something that it's not? Because they obviously have a vested interest, either themselves or their clients or someone else. They have a reason to have you think about it as something else besides what it is. One of my favorite quotes, one of my favorite legal quotes of all time, and I say it all the time. If it looks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, it's most likely a duck, even if it's holding a sign saying it's a chicken. If this law set looks like it's attacking something besides crime families, and its application is being used beyond crime families, and it operates in all contexts to extend beyond crime families, then it must be something designed to work beyond crime families. Even if someone's holding up a sign saying this is for crime families only, ignore it. Ignore the man behind the curtain. Pay attention to all the smoke and mirrors we have going on over here. Don't pay attention to what it actually is. Don't take the time to actually look at it, read it, understand it. Listen to us, and we're telling you it's not what you think it is. Looks like what it is. And I hope you guys will understand that's what it is and ignore anyone who's trying to divest you or deflect you in a different direction. As always, at the end of these videos, I have to start talking about what the ultimate purpose of this podcast is. What is the purpose of the Great Montana Conspiracy? What are our goals? Obviously, as I've mentioned several times over, I'm running a low-budget operation. I'm running off an iPhone 8. I don't have sophisticated recording equipment. I don't have a studio. My message doesn't get out there. It doesn't appear professional, and therefore, obviously, it suffers in comparison to some of these really skillful podcasters out there. And kudos to everyone out there who's doing a bang-up job getting information out there. Mad respect for you. The fact is, I don't have that. But if you'd like my message to get out, to get to a broader audience, to get to a more receptive audience, I have to be able to compete with the people who are getting their message out there, and that requires, unfortunately, you guessed it, money. I don't like asking for it. I would much rather operate completely without any profit or proceed and be able to completely do this without any request for support. But the truth is, I need support. I need support to get this operation going. It costs money to pay to be able to broadcast video versions of these, not audio versions. As anyone who goes back to my original podcasts knows. If I want to do interviews, have a split screen to be able to do interviews, I need to be able to have a bit more sophisticated editing software. I need to be able to have more sophisticated cameras. I'd like to set up a studio somewhere where I can actually bring someone in, sit across the table from them, or put them onto a larger video camera, which you see on the TV shows. Watch Bill Maher. He has these gigantic cameras. He brings people in and interviews them from all over the world. I'd love to be able to do that. It requires money. And unfortunately, that's where I have to request for support. And it doesn't have to be money. It could be material donations. If you have this equipment and you want to donate it to the cause, by all means. My address and means of making material donations, there it is. It's there. You can send me the equipment. I'll set it up. I'll work it. I'm really tech savvy. I can understand this stuff and set it up myself. I just need the equipment. If you want to, on the other hand, you want to support us financially to help us buy the equipment, to buy the space, to rent a facility, even if it's be a small little closet somewhere that we can set up a recording studio, by all means. Again, the information is there. If you have information that you want me to talk about on here, or if you have a story you want me to share, share it. Send the information to me. If you're a supervised or a person in custody, obviously I cannot communicate with you directly. I am a political prisoner, and as a consequence, I have limitations on what I can and cannot do. One of those things is I cannot communicate with somebody who's under official state supervision or custody. So that's where my information for my producer Bill comes in. Please reach out to him. As always, if you have any other ideas or suggestions for this podcast, by all means forward them. Obviously, this very video is responding to feedback. I don't agree with the feedback, and I obviously feel the feedback is designed to deflect away from the importance of this issue, but I do listen and I do respond. So by all means, send me your feedback, send me your ideas. I want to hear from you. That said, as always, I hope everyone's being safe out there, and I hope very sincerely that you will, if at all possible and whenever possible, be free. Thank you and have a good night.